The meeting to order. Good evening and welcome to the July 14th, 2025 study session of your Ashland City Council. This evening we have one agenda item on the agenda, which is the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. Sabrina?
Thanks, Mayor. Tonight we have Chris Chambers, and I'll let her introduce Charisse. We're going to go over the Ashland Community Wildfire Protection Plan. This has been many months in the making, and thank you to everyone who has participated. I know some of Mayor and Council has, as well as a lot of members of the community. So Chris is going to roll through his presentation. We'll answer questions at the end, so we make sure we get through the whole plan. It will be back August 19th for adoption. So if you have feedback or edits you would like to see, now is the time to present that to Chris and staff so we can get that completed in time so we can get it adopted. Chris, thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, councilors. Good to be here again. I want to quickly... Sorry, red microphone. Let me try that again for the studio audience. Madam Mayor, councilors, it's good to be here again. Thank you for hosting us. I'm going to introduce our team who's going to be presenting today. We've got Charisse Sidoriak, our Ragland award-winning volunteer who did an incredible amount of work on the CWPP. We have our CWPP contractor, Jerry McAdams, directly behind me, who has worked steadfastly with our team to put the document together, and also invited Sandra Slattery from the Ashland Chamber, one of our longtime partners in community wildfire and emergency preparedness, who also played a big role in helping put this document together and generating the content. Okay, with that, we are going to jump into the presentation, and I think we're going to flow all the way through this, hopefully within 1 hour, and then jump into questions and discussion after that. So, it is no surprise to anybody in this room, I'm sure, that Ashland is really at the center of the target for wildfire risk. We have a lot of factors that are converging on our community that create the situation for a potentially severe wildfire. We have a history of wildfires. We had the Alameda fire, the most destructive fire in Oregon's history, start in our backyard, and of course impact our neighboring communities as well as our own in 2020. And just on a personal note, I just want to say, and having worked in this job in various iterations of it since 2002, which included the first Community Wildfire Protection Plan in 2004, and I'll talk a little bit about the changes from then to now in the plans. But things have fundamentally changed considerably. And I know this is kind of a long quote, but I want to read it for the record and anybody that's listening out there, because it's really important. We must recognize that our communities were developed in a climate and environment that no longer exist. We have the tools and knowledge to reduce community wildfire risk, but we must address the profound and deeply rooted misalignment of political and social expectations regarding what it means to live with wildfire. Now is the time to invest in long-term, economically efficient solutions rather than short-term, risk-averse tactics. We have to live with wildland fire. We don't have to live with fire in our communities. This was a quote from a paper primarily written by Dave Calkin, who has spent some time here in Ashland just within the last year. And I've spent time with him in other places. Really one of the best thinkers on wildfire out there. And I believe it really speaks to where we are at this point in time as citizens of the earth and citizens of Ashland, Oregon. We really are at an inflection point. We have seen the worst happen very close to us, and that is unfortunately part of what is on the horizon as the climate keeps warming and drying, and we get conditions like we're seeing right now with a mass lightning storm coming through a week ago. I've already evacuated a house this year, and it's not even mid-July, so that's not a good thing, and this was our supposed good year when we had ample precipitation and a long wet winter and spring. But we see that maybe no longer is an indication of how severe our fire seasons are going to be. Yet at the same time, Ashland is really at the front of the pack nationally in preparing for wildfire. We have a lot of great experience under our belt managing the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project over a period of 15 years that came out of our 2004 CWPP. We became a national model for managing forests and managing it in a way that really coincided with values of our community and involved people in the process. And that experience, I think, speaks a lot to our community and our capacity to adapt to really challenging situations. And this is definitely one of those, and maybe one of the most challenging situations this community has ever faced. But with that success, I think we are well poised to ingest this tome and make sense of it and move forward in a way that involves the citizens of Ashland in a really cutting edge project that I don't think any community is attempting to undertake at this point in the same way as is envisioned in this CWPP. So, jumping in, what is a CWPP? It's our strategic plan to avoid a wildfire disaster. It's also a key to unlocking grant funding at all levels, and it directs the U.S. Forest Service, our federal partner and neighbor, to consider our community's priorities in what they do in doing the work in our watershed and adjacent lands. And the CWPP requires collaboration, measures to reduce structural ignitability, and prioritizing fuel reduction areas. It's really actually quite a simple prescription, and that comes out of the Healthy Forest Restoration Act back from 2003. So it leaves open a lot of interpretation, which is part of the success of CWPPs across the country. So what changed between 2004 and the 2025 Community Wildfire Protection Plans? I was one of the primary authors back in 2004. And at the time, that CWPP was kind of forced on the city, and it ended up being in a good way by the Forest Service, who had come up with a proposal to do a pretty large project in the city's watershed to protect both the community and our water resource. But time was limited to engage the full community. We had about 6 months to prepare this CWPP back then. The wildfire picture was a lot different in 2004 than it is right now. I don't need to explain a whole lot more about that. And we've had a major shift in that time from forest focus to now focused on preserving our community, our economy, and our way of life under the threat of urban conflagrations that have become all too common. And we are indeed, again, building on success of the AFR project, and both engaging the community, generating capacity to do work that at the outset seemed really challenging. We didn't know how we were going to implement AFR. We didn't know where the money was going to come from, and yet people stepped up. We engaged all levels of government, from Washington, D.C. to Salem to our own council and mayor. We came up with a project that actually ended up doubling what we had initially envisioned, more than doubling the amount of money that we were able to bring to bear on the project. And again, I think that speaks volumes to this community's capacity to adapt and move forward with incredibly important work that honestly transformed a lot of how communities look at their wildland areas across the country, certainly in our region. I want to introduce Jerry McAdams, our Certified Wildfire Mitigation Specialist, is what CWMS stands for, and our contractor for the CWPP, to give an outside perspective. Jerry travels a lot around the country as a consultant and has a lot of experience in this realm. So he's going to give a few words, and then we'll jump right back into the slides.
All right, Madam Mayor, councilors, thank you for allowing us to be here and share this project with you. It's very, very important. I want to underscore a couple things that Chris said. First and foremost, Ashland has been seen nationally as a leader in the area of wildfire preparedness and mitigation. Having said that, in going through this project over the last, year and a half, there is so much more that needs to be done. I can't say that enough. Chris had mentioned resilient landscapes and all the work that's been done in the resilient landscape section here. And when I talk about resilient landscapes, I'm pointing to the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy, which has 3 goals: resilient landscapes, safe, effective, and risk-based wildfire response, and then fire-adapted communities. The fire-adapted communities piece of that is really lacking. Okay, you guys have an older community, you have combustible homes, you have very high density. I don't want to steal Chris's thunder because he's going to show a graphic of the density in your community. And with high density communities, you are at risk for that urban conflagration. How many times have you all thought to yourselves, man, we were super lucky with the Alameda fire, right? How many times have you thought to yourselves, I hope that never actually happens to Ashland, right? I just want to say hope is not a strategy, okay? We need action behind that. This, when we first started this project, Chris and I and Charisse and Brian, we all talked about it. We were hoping for a 100-page document. Okay. There are lots of cookie cutter CWPPs around the country. This is not one of them. This is absolutely 100% representative of your community. Over 100 people in your community had input directly on this, in addition to all the surveys and everything that came out of it. It's 100% representative of your community. And the information that was drawn out of learning lessons from the Alameda fire were cooked and baked into this particular plan. Super important, you know, preparing for recovery and all the different initiatives in here. This is a terrific plan. I just want to say thanks to Chris and Charisse and everybody, Sandra and Brian, that were involved in this, and all the council members that were also involved in this process. Thank you very much. I feel privileged to be have been a part of this, and I do teach classes all around the country. I'm a retired firefighter from Boise, Idaho. I've known Chris in this community for a long time. I've been here numerous times, and you guys have some really cool things going for you, and you have a lot of work to do. Okay, I would highly encourage you to consider, you know, putting some additional capacity behind this. I know I've seen it in my own career and seeing it throughout the communities around us, including Ashland. There's limited capacity, right? There's only so much that the Superman here can do, and the other folks to do all the good work that needs to be done. I would encourage you to think about increasing capacity in this area. It is one of your highest risks in the community is wildfire, and I would greatly encourage you to think about that. There's a quote that's in the final thoughts section of the CWPP from Burton Hillis, who was a writer for Reader's Digest. I think he died in the 70s, long time ago. But it's to the effect of, there is a mighty big difference between reasons that sound good and good sound reasons. And so this, as representative of your community, has a lot of really good sound reasons in it. And I would highly encourage you to back up the good work that these folks are doing. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. I apologize, I forgot to introduce Brian Hendricks, our Fire Adapted Communities Coordinator. My neck just was hurting. Too much staring at a computer screen. Apologize, Brian. Okay, moving ahead. So our obligations based on the grant that we received from the USDA Forest Service to fund this process of rewriting our CWPP. Charisse and I worked a long time just on the grant application, and we had 10 things laid out that we needed to deliver on, kind of our contract with the Forest Service for this CWPP. So assessing community structure, ignitability, and filling risk assessment gaps, assessing critical infrastructure, strategy for vulnerable community members, citywide structural ignitability risk reduction, mitigating landscape wildfire potential, prevention strategies, health and safety, economic resilience, a post-fire recovery plan, and a strategy to secure sustainable funding. Those were all part of our deliverables for the grant, and I'm happy to say we met all of those with this CWPP. I mean, in 600 pages, we should have, right? It was definitely a process rooted in the community. This just shows all the different sectors of people that participated in the planning process, which also does not count all those that participated in surveys and or were surveyed in person, mostly by Charisse, and also a team of volunteers who went door to door to collect information. How the CWPP is organized, it starts with the vision, which trickles down to the goals, challenges, and then the initiatives, of which there are over 220, are our action items, our recipe for success, if you will. The vision reads, we envision a future where Ashland's fabric, economy, and spirit not only withstand wildfire, but grow stronger and more connected because of it. In this future, residents, students, workers, visitors, and pets remain safe during wildfires and return quickly to undamaged homes, schools, businesses, and gathering places. Glad pets made the list. Thank you. And then coming down to the goals, and I'm not going to read through all these, but just the highlighted ones. Stronger together, safer forever. Strengthen what matters, track what counts. Smart standards, big results. Strengthen our core, fund the mission, meaningful work, and massive impact. Again, already, we see where Ashland has stepped up to meet this challenge. The big red check mark is that, yay, thank you so much, City Council, for passing the wildfire risk reduction fee increase. That was an enormous step toward implementing this document and this plan and doing things that are going to save property and lives in our community. 100%. Thank you for voting that in. That was a really important step. That will be seed money that will create a down payment and result in a lot more money coming to this community for this critical work. This is kind of an overview of the topics that are addressed in the CWPP, how it's organized and the chapters. It's a wide range. Wildfire touches just about everything in this community, from our economy to recreation, rental properties, the economy, I said it already, recovery, community health. I don't think you would find one strand in the community that is not connected to the issue of wildfire in some way. So Sharice is going to jump in now and talk about our surveys of the community and the various populations that we reached out to, and some of her work specifically engaging with socially vulnerable populations.
I'm going to introduce myself real briefly because I suspect some of you don't know me. Why is a volunteer sitting here? I'm not a staff member and contributed substantially, like 2 years of my life, to writing this plan. Why would I do that? I was a fire management officer in the National Park Service, and in one of my duty stations, a fire burned my community, and I was responsible for that fire. 420 families lost their homes. I developed severe PTSD and moved to Ashland so no one would know me. And then I started seeing cities burning around Ashland, and I said, this is ridiculous for me to sit on my hands and do nothing about it. So I've decided to make this my permanent home, and I'd like the community to survive. That's why I'm here. So one of the things that I noticed right away when I decided to stick my nose into the city's business was that there was a pattern of talking to people rather than with people about what their needs and interests were. And I learned by studying the literature and listening to people that the most effective way of promoting behavioral changes is to talk to people one-on-one, face-to-face. And that's one of the reasons why the socially vulnerable populations show up in a deliverable in this plan. It is not in other plans. Involving the community like we have is not in other plans. So I want to tell you a little bit about that involvement process. The most effective way of talking to people is face-to-face, but how do you do that with a population of 22,000? You have to do some sampling, and most of the time it's done through surveys. This process of outreach to respondents started in 2015 by Chris when he contracted with the Center for Social Ecology, I can't remember the whole thing, and public policy. And they interviewed by just sitting in cafes and on the street, talking to people, what are your concerns? What should we talk about in the CWPP? And they found out some interesting things, but they didn't try to separate out homeowners or renters or social status, any of those kinds of things, but it was a start. Then in 2019, associated with the curbside risk assessments that Brian did, was a study by U.S. Forest Service to identify concerns of people in the WUI. And the WUI was defined at that time as the hills above Ashland and a portion of North Meadow Mountain, or the area in the grasslands down below, where the Almeida fighters started. And to compare what people said they thought was at risk versus what was really observed as a risk. So that was one more input, but it focused on homeowners. It was a very narrowly defined population. Then there was the evacuation time study, which is essentially what we are currently working on with the zones. And they sent out a survey. A lot of people responded to that survey, talking about how they would evacuate. That was considered in the development of our current planning process. And then we came to 2024. There are a lot of people not represented in those former studies. So we convened a working group, invited university people, people from the local community that serve socially responsible individuals, and invited volunteers to help us interview people who are socially vulnerable. The definition of socially vulnerable in this context is low income, housing insecure, seniors, single parents, and limited English speaking skills. But where do you find them? That's not easy to figure out. In any case, we ended up interviewing 225 people, door to door knocking with student volunteers and other volunteers in the community, and ended up interviewing 171 people who met that qualification as they self-identified. Then we also issued an online survey for the season, for the CWPP. 319 people responded to that. We also worked as a working group to interview property management companies, because we're very interested in the rental population, which is 47% of the residents of Ashland. And most of the focus so far has been on single-family homeowners. So this is a big divergence. And then we also interviewed or surveyed private rental individuals, owners who self-rent. Next slide. This work in this document here, I would say the body of it is about 50% of that topic. The appendices, the report I wrote on the whole community voices and on socially vulnerable populations makes up 200 or 300 pages of this report. It's a wealth of information that would not have otherwise been gathered if volunteers hadn't stepped forward to collect the information to help us strategize in a customized manner solutions to their needs. The engagement highlights here are a synopsis of all those 300 pages or so. Basically, outreach gaps, traditional communication methods fail to reach many socially vulnerable individuals. You need to have hands-on, trusted community engagement to make them part of this solution. Renters' challenges, since it's half of the community, but tenants have little control over their wildfire risk, and many have resource gaps. If the city burns, the danger of displacement is high. Barriers to action, financial constraints, remarkably, were quoted most often by the most wealthy, the single-family homeowners. The SUVs don't seem to have it within their radar because they're just living. That's the way it looks. Physical limitations, many, many different demographics for that, including disabled. Oh, that was another socially vulnerable population we interviewed. And then there are key mitigation challenges that were cited, workforce gaps, misinformation, and weak accountability hinder effective wildfire risk reduction efforts. So those are just some highlights. Next slide. One of the things that this plan does is it listened to what everybody said and it distilled it into these challenge statements. There are 44 challenge statements. The ones for residential risk reduction are 5 of them are stated here. It basically summarizes what we found and what we need to deal with. There are 18 initiatives associated with these challenge statements that say what we need to do. Next slide. For the renters preparedness challenge statements, same thing. This is what they face, and I think there were 13 initiatives to resolve their needs. And the socially vulnerable populations, about the same number. But what's really critical here is that the socially vulnerable households tend to underestimate their wildfire risk, and they face more barriers to reducing that risk. We do not have a program in place to deal with that. Although there are many social service organizations that serve them, we need to capitalize on their connections and come up with new customized solutions to engage them in problem solving. Here's just a couple of snippets of the 4 risk reduction barriers that were made clear at various points. 84% of renters said they had lacked agency to do anything. And since property management companies and homeowners who rent their homes out, very few of them said they actually paid much attention to wildfire risk. That's a real serious problem. 1 in 5 residents are below the federal poverty level. This is access information. So how do they have the capacity to take action to make their homes safer? 22% of SVPs reported that they haven't received wildfire safety information. And then single-family residences, 50% just about of homeowners say they have physical difficulty doing mitigation work. So this is a couple of snippets. There's a whole lot more in the plan. And one of the things that the survey did was 319 people responded to the CWPP survey, and we asked the question, how urgent do you think it is that we do something as a community? 77% said that we need to take action as quickly as possible. Next slide.
Thank you, Sharice. Sharice's work on that topic was absolutely amazing. She spent hundreds of hours interviewing people out in the field and actually organized a whole team to do the same. So I think it's a depth of exploration into understanding our community that we have seldom taken. And now I want to introduce, who actually needs no introduction, Sandra Slattery, Executive Director for the Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber has been a trusted and longtime partner in emergency preparations that for well over a decade now, particularly our SmokeWise Ashland program. And I just want to say, when I started talking about a partnership to implement the CWPP, Sandra just jumped right up and said, we're in. I just barely even had to ask. So thank you, Sandra, for being here. And I'll take your time to talk about the economic stability piece of the CWPP.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And thank you very much for making emergency preparedness and wildfire a priority for the City Council. I think it shows great leadership on your part, so thank you for that. Chris has asked me to hit a few highlights of the work, the body of work that we've done collectively, because that's really what we built the economic stability section of the plan on. So I'll give you some of that background. We also, the committee that Chris referred to, is now called our Emergency Preparedness Committee, but it was formed, as he said, over a decade ago. Prior to that, we've really been partnering with Ashland Fire and Rescue for probably 20-some years. We have believed that wildfire resiliency and smoke mitigation was an important thing for the chamber to focus on, even though it's a really unusual area for most chambers to work on. Our role is to educate and promote and advocate for a healthier, stronger, and more resilient economy in all ways. I know that people choose to live here because of the sense of place. And so it's a critical asset for us that we believe makes our ties to our environment even more critical and essential to our future and our economy. And so we also recognize, many many years ago that if we were to experience a significant wildfire or a fire within the community, it would not only devastate our economy, but we would have such environmental consequences and broader economic challenges for decades that it would be very difficult for us to consider Ashland anything close to what it is now that we all love. So we have written letters to our federal legislators, advocated for years, and did a number of things that we felt were important. But over 10 years ago, Chris approached me and said, let's talk about that, because this is such an asset. What can we do together? And we just started talking about how we might form a collaboration. And so we created at that time the Fire Prevention Task Force, and it became an officially sanctioned committee of the chamber, but also of the city. So it was very unusual. The City of Ashland's Wildfire Mitigation Commission approved this collaboration. And so we created this group of people, of citizens, of business owners, community organizations, city staff, and we started meeting and just said, what can we do together? How can we share this information that's so important? Because what's good for business is also good for everyone in the economy or in the community and vice versa. We created a wildfire summit. We sponsored a film on the era of megafires to educate people about, well, why are we in this place that we're in? And then we had 45 days of consistent smoke above the unhealthy level. And those of you that lived here will remember that summer. And what we thought we were prepared for, we found out we weren't. And communication was the biggest issue. So we brought the group back in the fall and said, what can we do? And we looked around for a national model and couldn't find anything. And so we said, okay, let's build our own. And we created SmokeWise Ashland. So that was the first of, we can do this, right? We can create something for our community to better inform our citizens, our businesses, and our visitors. We met with the governor, brought her down at the time, and we ended up getting a direct grant for the Oregon Shakespeare Festival to put in a whole new HVAC system. Because the Bomer Theater, the actors couldn't perform because of the smoke, and visitors didn't want to sit in there and watch plays. We got a grant to do a wildfire perception study of our visitor economy. We met with the Oregon House of Representatives and their Economic Development and Trade Commission. And then through the work with Fire Adapted, we participated in some big national meetings, shared our work. We created workshops, and through that, SOU was able to change some of their air systems and became a smoke refuge during times of high smoke. The YMCA and the co-op were able to take the work from the workshops and develop new systems within their organizations. And the Ashland School District was able to upgrade their existing HVAC systems, and then with the upcoming bond at the time, were able to build in a whole new system so when they built the new buildings, they could actually have better air for our children. So we took all that work, we talked to our businesses and said, what do you need? And they said, we're really busy. We can't do this on our own, we need help. So we created hands-on workshops. We created tent cards with QR codes to send them to a site on our website that we created in collaboration with the city on a toolkit, an emergency preparedness toolkit that people could walk through. And if they could only do one thing, they could do that. Then they could take to the next step and the next step after that. We created a business preparedness workbook where a business could assess their current situation, determine where their own weaknesses were through a self-assessment, and then give them ideas on how they could then improve their systems. We created a number of videos, pushed those out. And then in 2024, after talking with Chris, we pivoted our committee and we said, okay, we're gonna focus our entire year on working on the CWPP. So we took that whole body of work, tore it apart, said what works, what doesn't, where are weaknesses, how can we grow, what's working with our businesses. And that's how we came up with the initiatives and the core of the plan that is in here on economic stability, which I won't go through and read to you because I know you can read those things yourself. But the highlights really show you that what we realize is we really need to have the ability to assess individual businesses' preparedness and where are their internal gaps. Because, we know we're made up of small businesses in our community. We need to continue to update all of our toolkits and our videos and our communication strategy across all platforms, virtually, in person. We need to gather when we do have a smoke event. Unfortunately, we probably will, and we need to know how that impacts our community, our businesses. We want to create information on emergency preparedness for our visitor sector. We have a lot of people who don't live here, and they're not going to get that information. So how do we communicate with people who are visiting our community on a short-term basis? We know that workshops work, that hands-on small group gatherings really do provide people with the tools that they can utilize. We know we need to do more of them, or want to do more of them. Forums also are really great for people just to sit around a table and talk and share, and that's been very, very beneficial for our group. And then we know that we need structure hardening education for businesses, because that's new information. It's much like a lot of the things that have been talked about with residential hardening. How do you look at that if you're a business owner? And what does defensible space mean for a business? How do you deal with that? How do you have programs in place for your employees? We know through the Alameda fire that we have a transient population of employment, that we share a labor shed with the rest of our valley. So a lot of people who work in our businesses don't necessarily live here. And how do we then communicate with them? So there's many elements that you can read about that we realize need additional effort. Our plan now is to reconvene the committee now that we've completed this work, because we're ready to take the next steps, take a look at it and say, what can we do that we can further this work? And then we know that we're going to need additional funding to do this at the level and the scale that it needs to be done. But we're prepared to do that. I think a piece that's been really important to me is, while none of us really wants to think in terms of recovery, it's not fun to think about at all. But we know that the better prepared we are before an emergency, the highest chance of survival our businesses will then have. Many of the businesses, we work regionally, and I know the challenges that many of the talent businesses have experienced. Phoenix as well, but talent, very few businesses were able to survive and rebuild, and it's tragic. And we want to do everything we can to help people ahead of time. It's not fun, but we are the stewards of our economic future, and we take it seriously, and we think about it a lot. So I just want to thank Chris and the city and our committee. Greg White is the chair of our committee. He's also the current president of the chamber. He owns Reinhold and O'Hara Insurance, the oldest insurance company in Ashland, and very, very involved in fire insurance. And he is happy to answer any questions you might have. He will be at your August meeting in support of this program. So happy to answer any questions whenever. That was fast. Maybe it didn't feel like it, but it was fast. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I really appreciate your ongoing partnership.
Thanks.
Okay, we're moving forward. Connected to what Sandra was talking about and how to educate our visitor population, the employees who work here in Ashland, and of course, people who live here year-round about health when times of smoke are here, as well as evacuation protocols and communication. We have a whole chapter dedicated to community health and safety, a working group that was run by Kelly Burns, our emergency manager, put together a lot of great recommendations. You can see some of the challenges here. Also, Sarah Jones, who runs our SmokeWise program, participated in that. We do have a community smoke response plan that is in a continuous update cycle every year. That's brought into the CWPP, as well as findings from our natural hazard mitigation plan through Jackson County. So you're going to see a lot, and I know this is a particularly important topic to a lot of citizens in Ashland, is how are we going to get out of this city when there's a big wildfire? We are doing a lot to try to address that by taking on some issues head on in the plan. We're also doing some really incredible research. We have several research projects with universities that are kind of embedded in the CWPP and also ongoing. One of those is working with Boise State as a lead of a consortium of universities looking at evacuation modeling, doing some social surveys to understand people's behaviors, and making recommendations based on that. That'll be available later this summer.
Can I say something?
Yep.
There are 37 initiatives associated with this particular topic, so it's very well represented in the plan. The other thing that I wanted to point out is the event that's planned for this Wednesday is planned by community members. The city is a partner, they are not the lead. And that is one of the things that we are trying to promote, is community-led solutions and initiatives, so that the city doesn't have to bear the burden of something that is impossible to achieve if the community doesn't participate.
Moving on to a topic near and dear to my heart, wildfire fuels management, both in our forested areas, but also in all of the areas that surround the city. We do have a new initiative, a new challenge in here, and looking at what would happen from a fire coming out of the grassland areas. Some lessons learned from the Alameda fire and how it started in grass and burned in a lot of light, flashy fuels along the Greenway. And then also to importantly say, we are not stepping away from our work in the forest just because it's not the emphasis of this CWPP. Doesn't mean we're leaving any of that behind. We're still prioritizing the maintenance of our forest lands through prescribed burning and actually taking on some new initiatives as well. I had a great meeting with a committee of the Mount Ashland Association about protecting the asset that is our local community ski area. One of the things that makes Ashland a fabulous place to live is having Mount Ashland accessible for winter recreation, and they're already thinking about how vulnerable the ski area is to wildfire and what to do about it. So this plugs right into work already ongoing through the Mount Ashland Association, who wants to partner with us. We did do a lot of work, thanks to council and dedicated funding, to deal with the tree die-off that was happening next to town. But on the federal side of the line, nothing has been done where areas have died off that are not city managed. So that's a priority. And then the strategic field break issue, I have one image to illustrate that. This comes out of our evacuation study with Boise State. What if that fire on Alameda had started at Immigrant Lake? And actually, that fire almost did start at Immigrant Lake during the middle of Alameda, but was extinguished quickly by responding firefighters from the Green Springs, right about where this fire in the picture, fictitious fire, is started for this exercise. What I want to illustrate with this is, though flames could come into Ashland and impact neighborhoods, businesses, the university in Ashland, we can work with landowners outside of the city to try to mitigate some of that fuel in the grassland and brush areas just outside of the city limits towards Immigrant Lake, which is one of our vulnerable points. We have not attempted to do that so far. It is definitely a vulnerability, and it's a way we could slow down fire, perhaps allow firefighters to get a handle on it, and give people time to evacuate. Okay, moving on to one of the most, if not the most important challenge in the whole community wildfire protection plan is how essentially do we make our city less susceptible to an urban conflagration, a severe wildfire, and establishing a goal to reduce our wildfire risk by 90% in 10 years. That is a really audacious, big picture goal, but we really believe that we have to set something that seems a little bit unachievable, and similar looking back to the 2004 CWPP, nobody knew how we were going to come up with $12 million. We came up with $33 million. Yeah, right now we do have a plan to achieve this, but it does seem a little bit pie in the sky, and yet we have to have a meaningful goal that will protect our citizens and our infrastructure and our property and our economy and all that's connected to it. And the science around this topic is really settling out on this 90% number as researchers have gone in and looked at previous wildfires all around, figuring out, what amount of mitigation really matters in a community like ours, which is high density. And that is a specific category in the research referenced by NIST, which is the National Institute for Standards and Technology. This map in purple shows all the high density areas as they've defined them, looking at previous wildfires and the distance between structures, which is a really key factor that leads to wildfire losses in the urban environment. So we have a lot of amazing data. Brian and a crew worked on our risk assessment. I'll go into it in just a little bit. This is one of those products, but a key risk factor. So why do we need to turn the corner and do something different? As I mentioned, I've worked on this topic here for over 20 years. I helped start the FireWise Communities program, helped get the FEMA grant for the city that we've worked on. And my personal experience, if I could distill that all down, is voluntary programs, even programs with incentives where we're paying people to do the right thing, is just not enough. We don't get the kind of rates of participation, and we never will, to get to that 90% level to protect our community. People who are interested in participating, participate. Those who don't want to participate, just ignore the offers. We unfortunately, through the carrot method, are not ever going to get to a meaningful place of mitigation and protecting this community. It was maybe a year into the FireWise program when our first FireWise coordinator came to me and said, I'm tired of hearing people complain about their neighbors. The people who want to do the right thing are doing the right thing, but there are so many people who are just ignoring the FireWise program. And FireWise has proven, unfortunately, well, I guess on the positive side, a lot has happened under FireWise Communities programs. It has motivated neighborhoods, but it also lacks participation rate. It has no standards. It doesn't require people to participate. There's no requirement for a level of mitigation on each property. So it feels good to have been the #1 FireWise USA city in the country for a number of years, but it really hasn't panned out to be the program that is going to get us to the place where we can feel like we are safe from wildfire.
It also demands a huge amount of city staff time.
Indeed it does. The FEMA grant experience is similar. We reached out to the first 400 highest risk properties in Ashland, and of those, less than half even responded to participate. We were offering over $2,000 per household just to do the defensible space portion of it. And people are just busy. It's hard to get a hold of people. Some people aren't interested in participating. We have to get to that critical mass in order to be able to say that we are safe from wildfire. And unfortunately, even offering people free money isn't getting us there. So aligning our community safety with science-based codes will allow us to withstand the inevitable fires of the future. And unfortunately, that has to involve some degree of enforcement. And that is baked into the CWPP. And again, we are on notice having had the Amelita fire happen in our own backyard. A quick video, and I think this is really meaningful because it shows the kinds of changes that we can make and that are already being made in our new construction where we passed codes years ago to get the kind of example that you're going to see right here built into our community. So it's through experiments like that and also a lot of post-mortem reviews of communities that have experienced severe wildfires that we have learned the lessons. It's been written up in the research. It is pretty solid at this point, established science of what we can do to prevent the kind of wildfire catastrophe that we've seen right here in our own backyard. We have cutting edge mapping. Again, the group that Brian led, we commissioned Rogue Reconnaissance, a local contractor, to do a LiDAR mapping, which is from a drone. Basically, you shoot a light all across the community or any landscape and you measure the returns. It's a really, really high resolution way of measuring what's on the landscape. That LiDAR data is being used to map fuels across our community, the structure threat on each property. It is really a cutting edge experiment in measuring risk across a community. We've had help from Oregon State University in doing the data assessment. I think it's going to be a really important tool. It's a snapshot of what our community looked like in this past year when we did the LiDAR flights. So it's something that we can refer back to measure our progress. And many, many other things. We can assess threats to infrastructure. We've actually looked at power poles throughout the entire community and said how much vegetation is around each wooden power pole. That's just one slice of the data. We can look at evacuation routes and exposure. The possibilities are endless, and we'll continue to use that data. Other key content in the CWPP, we looked at electric infrastructure. That's already, I'm going to go back and forth for a second here. That's already in our wildfire mitigation plan that was required by the state of Oregon as a result of the 2020 fires. We have a really great wildfire mitigation plan. Our electric department is doing an amazing job of implementing that plan already. They've switched out fuses throughout almost all of Ashland with more fire-safe fuses, and they're in the process of replacing poles across the community to avoid the kind of thing that's in the picture right there that happened in many places during the Alameda fire that cut off evacuation routes, cut off routes for first responders, and of course led to a lot of damage to infrastructure that was costly and took a long time to repair. We can use the data and that LiDAR assessment to look at where poles are most vulnerable. We're working with our GIS team right now to do that mapping exercise and to help create priorities for our electric utility. Oops, go back this way. The water system analysis piece is also really exciting, and another research project we're doing with Oregon State University, the College of Engineering. We're looking at, they've created a model to essentially figure out why the water system failed in Phoenix and Talent, and they've actually successfully now predicted when that would happen in the model, and it coincides with how it happened in real life. So we're going to take that model and those parameters and then put it into the Ashland water system and say, how far can we push the system until it breaks? And what can we do to help it not break in the end, which leads to contamination. That's been documented over a lot of communities who have had these water system failures where you depressurize your system and suck in a whole bunch of very harmful contaminants into your pipes, which is not a good thing. Paradise actually ended up replacing almost their entire water system because of that after their fire. It's a really exciting piece of research that our team at Oregon State is really excited to write up a paper about and get it published, but we will have results later this summer about that. The insurance crisis we're going to dive into in a little bit more detail here, and then a piece about wildfire recovery planning. The insurance crisis is something that is very palpable right now and is happening across our community and across communities throughout the entire country, whether it is flood, hurricanes, tornadoes, but especially wildfire for our circumstance. Insurance rates, as most of you know, are going up quickly, as well as people experiencing total loss of coverage and not being able to find insurance coverage in the market at all. There's a kind of a fallback plan with the state, but it's not very good coverage. And it is a big challenge that potentially undermines a lot of our economy and our housing market. And Charisse has some bullet points to cover on the insurance crisis.
Well, most Ashland homeowners are insured based on the studies that I've done. Affordability and access to coverage are growing concerns, particularly for residents in high-risk areas like mobile home parks and homes near wildlands.
Charisse, could you get in a little closer to that microphone or pull it closer to you?
I'm sorry, I didn't realize.
We can hear you okay, but I just want to make sure the people at home can. Okay.
The number of uninsured renters in Ashland is significant, which means that many could lose all assets and be unable to find affordable temporary housing if their rental unit burns. Some insurers will only insure properties that might that meet fire-resistant standards. I have an experience this last week. I bought a townhome in an area that is not considered much at risk, and I was told the day before closing that I might not get the insurance. It's surrounded by parklands, has no trees overhanging it, the roof is older, and it has some shrubs against it. And right before closing, I'm told by State Farm that the red line they are drawing for insuring homes is becoming very bright. And they are considering not insuring any homes that don't have 0 to 5 cleared space in the future. Their underwriters are demanding this. So the insurance crisis is really here. And it's not just from a wildfire, it is floods and other things. One of the former counselors, Doug, his insurance rates went up 700% last year. They didn't want to insure him, that's their way of saying it. A lot of people are being dropped. And what I discovered by interviewing and through the surveys is that some people are choosing not to be insured. The consequences this has when our community burns, if we can't stop it, is that people can't come back. And we'll get into that in the recovery section. Many socially vulnerable residents are uninsured, leaving them financially unprotected and at risk of displacement when wildfire occurs. Our community would be transformed. Rising insurance costs and wildfire risks also threaten business stability, housing security, and Ashland's socioeconomic viability, with rebuilding efforts expected to take years. The things that I put up on that slide were things that represented the situation in Ashland specifically. This is not unique to Ashland, but I wanted to bring it home. We have invited the Insurance Institute of Business and Home Safety, which is up on this next slide here, to give us a Zoominar to the whole community about this program, Protect Your Home from Wildfire, Wildfire Prepared Homes, and we hope to host insurance representatives from the state and locally at this Zoominar on August 21st to talk about this situation. We're in the planning stage for it. Anyway, we really are in a crisis here. If there is a crisis, as you can read on the flow chart on this screen, if you can't get insurance, you can't get a loan, you can't own a home, and home values drop precipitously. There are areas in the United States that are in danger of being what they call climate abandonment areas because they cannot insure homeowners or structures. So this is quite serious, and one of the things that might motivate people to really pay attention to the need to make their homes safer, less at risk. We can focus on evacuation and keeping people alive, but if there's no home to come back to, we've lost the community.
I'll just say about the Wildfire Prepared Home Program, it is available to any resident right now in Ashland who wants to engage in that program. It is limited to single-family homes up to, I forget what the parameters are on the, like, it's not like big apartment complexes yet.
Only single-family homes.
They are considering a program that would also involve entire neighborhoods to be rolled out soon. But you can get a certificate from this program that is good with many insurance companies to keep at least maybe arrest some of the precipitous incline in the cost of insurance, but also ultimately to keep insurance, period. And this could be one of the most important things that we can offer people. It doesn't involve us going out there and evaluating anybody's house. It is all done through this nonprofit, IBHS. And so I think that's a really important point right now that is available to any homeowner in Ashland. Thinking about recovery from wildfire, while we didn't start out thinking that we were going to build an entire wildfire recovery plan, it became even more apparent as we put together this big plan that we were not going to have the time and resources within the CWPP to have a standalone recovery plan for wildfire. So the CWPP honestly kind of kicks that can down the road, makes recommendations that we need to come up with a full-on wildfire recovery plan in the future. in part to avoid, well, not that we would necessarily be able to avoid this, but what happened in Paradise post-fire, property values plummeted. They have lost nearly 70% of their population. People moved away who, for many reasons, can't afford to or don't want to live in the community anymore. And insurance costs, like many communities, even that haven't burned, have gone up significantly, raising the cost of living. Having a recovery plan, we can anticipate some of these things and come up with measures to try to counter those. All right, moving into the last piece of this presentation, getting to work. How do we make this plan turn from this big chunk of paper here into something real and tangible in our community? We have a whole list of implementation priorities. Yes, it's an expensive proposition, but we can keep working on that. Revamping codes and ordinances, and we're going to drill into this idea of the implementation team a little bit, and certainly need a lot of outreach in our community, evacuation systems, and doing more wildfire risk assessments. All right, what does the CWPP ask of Ashland in terms of leadership? Well, the city obviously needs to be a leader in this. We are already having this conversation. That's a huge step. The city council has already passed the wildfire risk reduction fee, another huge step in leadership. We need to make sure that our city-owned buildings and properties are an example for the community. There's nothing worse than approaching a community member and saying, you need to do this, and then they look at a city facility and say, well, why isn't the city doing this already if we are going to have to do this? That is one place that we can lead by example. We should expect pushback. This isn't easy. It's going to be challenging. People are used to doing things a certain way, and changing those old habits is challenging. And if we can figure out how to fund or co-fund a dedicated facilitator and leader for this entire project over the next decade, that would be a really good thing in order to get from plan to implementation. We do have, of course, staff, myself, Brian, others that work on this topic, but adding it to our plates is going to be challenging. Being visible and accountable, certainly keeping equity as a lens on a focus on this, and that's baked into the CWPP. Developing partnership is really important. There are a lot of community members and organizations who want to engage on this topic. Workforce training is a huge opportunity. We have a workforce out there that is working on people's landscapes constantly throughout this community. You see them driving around all over town. They're just not doing the right things. We need to retrain them to do the right kind of mitigation so that they can provide that opportunity for their customers, especially on rental properties. Ashland will look different, and that is by design. Back to the quote that we are out of sync with our environment and how we live at this point in time, and we have to get back in sync with our environment, the hot and dry that we're seeing outside right now. Again, same quote again, coming full circle. Now is the time to invest in long-term economically efficient solutions rather than short-term risk-averse tactics. And that is what is in our community wildfire protection plan. Our next steps, August 19th, the business meeting, we will be bringing this topic back for adoption. Beyond that, what do we do once it's adopted? We start to build a partnership around implementing this. This isn't just, and by design, I actually had Jerry take the city logo off the front. This isn't the city government's plan. This belongs to the community. We're stewarding it, we're shepherding it, we're bringing it to the council, which is an obvious step, but that doesn't mean that the city is the only entity that's going to implement this. We have to make this broad-based and owned by the community, by the organizations, and all of the institutions that operate and function here in Ashland, or else this CWPP will not succeed. We need to apply for external funding, and we are going to create a spending or spending plan using the CWPP priorities for the wildfire risk reduction fee shortly on the heels of the adoption of the plan. All right, that wraps it up. Well, I think we did it in an hour. Wow. Thank you for listening patiently. I know it's kind of hard to hold your tongues when there's so much information that we're presenting, but we do have now a lot of time for discussion and questions. So thank you for listening. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for your presentation and for the good work that this involves. I know when we first started talking about updating the CWPP, we knew how much work it was going to be just because of how much the landscape literally has changed in terms of this issue. And I know when you and I talked about it right at the beginning, there was a big conversation around really making sure that we hit this home hardening, structure hardening, community resilience element at the level that it needed to be hit. And I think the public engagement has been spectacular. And I think it's an example to us in a lot of the different things that we have in front of us of the kind of public engagement that leads to those longer term results, right? It's about that buy-in. It's about helping our community understand why we are going to do the things that we are about to do and why we have to make some changes. You know, all of that coming in a vacuum doesn't work very well. And it also helps us understand what is likely to be most effective because people are telling us where they're at now and we know we have to meet them there. So I just wanted to say I was really impressed when you put all of the engagement in one place. I said, you know, it struck me that I knew about all of those and seeing them all in one place really shows the depth of that engagement. And I think that that's the foundation from which this cultural shift has to be built. And so thank you, Charisse. Thank you to all of the other volunteers who stepped in and to our contractor. That's the kind of team really that needed to be assembled around a risk of this size. And so it's an amazing body of work, I will say. Wouldn't we all say? Making our way through that and seeing it get to the place of, you know, what does it mean then to implement it? So with that, I will open it up for questions. Councilor Bloom.
Sure, I'll start off. Thank you so much for putting this together. I mean, this is not only a model based on just for the topic we're discussing, but I think really a model to look at for strategic plans in general for the city and the community involvement that you did to do this. I'm really interested, obviously, in kind of being proactive here and talking about implementation. And obviously, one of the biggest challenges to implementation is funding sources. Obviously, we recently, increased the fee for the wildfire program, and I remember kind of going around the table and everybody agreeing that the CWPP is coming, and this is probably not going to be enough money generated from the fee. Now, there's a variety of ways that we can go about doing that, and I was really interested in the appendices. Was a C, the funding mechanisms, and looking at what other municipalities can do. I'm curious, was there any conversation with whether outside attorneys or even the city's attorneys on some of these other mechanisms that other communities are doing and which ones are viable for us, right? I mean, obviously, property tax is kind of an issue for us. We're kind of locked in on what we can do. Sales tax, well, we live in Oregon, we're limited there. So, what of these funding types, beyond the obvious like bonds, are possible here in Ashland, one, and two, is there any thought given to our wildfire fee and what is obviously would love to generate tons of revenue and go all out, but what is realistic that you would like to see to be able to kind of implement a lot of these recommendations here?
Well, I'll start. The list that we compiled there was as much to show that other communities are putting some skin in the game, as much as it was to actually show examples of what that skin was that was going into the game. I know that some of those things we can't implement here in Oregon for various reasons or just wouldn't fly with our local politics. There obviously there's a kind of a broad range there. That the fee was what council chose to go with for our funding source. It seems totally appropriate. It didn't really matter so much what the source was, but that we did something. And actually, the council jumping ahead of the CWPP and putting the fee in place to create that the down payment towards funding externally and for the future was the most important outcome there, not necessarily how it was created. Now, if we're thinking how could we add on to that fee and another funding source, there are some challenges there, and that's something we'd have to sit down with our legal team and figure out what can we functionally do. There's a lot of ideas in there, but I would say probably the vast majority of them aren't going to happen here, and that's okay. I think we're going to have to reassess that when we see the availability of funding at the state and federal level, what strings come attached with that funding. I'm encouraged that the state legislature passed $43 million worth of wildfire prevention funding in this last session. How that is going to trickle down to communities is the big question mark, but in the past we've been really successful in getting dollars from Oregon Department of Forestry and the Oregon State Fire Marshal's Office to do kinds of mitigation projects. And I think with this CWPP in place, it will attract a lot of interest because of its nature. I mean, it's a bold vision. I think a lot of communities haven't thought this way about their CWPP. And I hope that's going to attract investment to see, can one community actually tackle this problem in a way that is really cohesive, with an equity lens built into it. I hope, fingers crossed, that that is going to really help us be able to market this program to get that kind of funding that we envision to actually do the work.
Can I answer something too?
Go ahead.
We're good.
I was really pleased that the fee was passed before we turned this in. We had calculated that we wanted $8, but you got pretty close. That's wonderful. From my perspective as a volunteer, not as a city staff person, I have worked with the city staff for years, 2 of them that really work on this topic, and they are so overworked and overstretched that if this plan will languish if there's an expectation that they implement, that they facilitate implementation. It won't happen. So the requirement, I'm calling it a requirement because I see it as the only solution, is that you have to get the community to carry some of the burden. And we need to learn how to do that. Some people have recommended in the comments that we have a real estate sales tax of some sort. They practice that in California.
Colorado too.
Yeah. And they were pushed really hard in their comments for it. That's one option. A bond, I think, is almost inevitable. But to do anything at all requires a dedicated person to see that the CWPP is implemented, because to get the community engaged, you have to have partners. That means building relationships, raising money, facilitating appropriate spending of that money. And I know the whole thought of a new position is abhorrent, but I can't see a solution otherwise, however the funds are raised for that. And that's my personal opinion. I don't represent the city, but watching the city function and these 2 dedicated employees try and to get what they need to get done, it's so clear to me that we lack the capacity as if we don't hire a person to implement the CWPP.
And that person, we're not saying has to be part of the city government organization. There are a lot of other wildfire collaborative models that operate out there. The city or the state of California has an entire organization built around organizing around wildfire called Fire Safe Councils. So that we say that we need leadership. That doesn't mean that we're going to turn around and come back at the next council meeting and say, hey, we need another FTE for this. We're just saying that this project needs leadership. That doesn't necessarily mean a staff position on the city.
Councilor Kaplan? Is it still on this track?
100%.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. And I certainly don't think that the idea is abhorrent to have a full-time dedicated person, and I certainly wouldn't be opposed for an FTE for the city. Now, kind of going back through, am I correct that the number was about 8 million a year is kind of the idea investment-wise?
It is a pretty rough calculation, I will be the first to admit, but we took the costs that we were incurring in the FEMA project for defensible space with, I think, a conservative estimate that would represent the home hardening or structure hardening piece of it. I really think of those as equal parts, so you got to do defensible space and you got to do some structure hardening to get the whole package for wildfire protection. The numbers that we ran were real numbers from the FEMA grant at that point, I think it was 135 participants in the program had actually paid. So I feel really good about the defensible space part. The home hardening part is more of a swag at the costs. It kind of does depend ultimately what programs and or maybe our own code adoption would require of structures for hardening. But just based on the literature out there, I think it's a good neighborhood estimate. And then looking across the community at the number of structures that we have, including all the businesses as well and institutions, some of that we're going to find is already meeting standards. And so maybe the number will be less. Tried to overestimate that if I could.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'd be curious going forward, especially into the next biennium, to kind of how we could zero in on what that amount would be. Obviously, there's unpredictability in what we can get for grants and what the legislature might pass through in terms of funding. But if the city could start all of us could start kind of putting our heads together and thinking like, well, what would 25% of that 8 million be, and how do we get to that number? I think that it'll allow some predictability in funding for this program. And as you pointed out, Sharice, investment from the state and saying, hey, look, they're committing this. How can we match that to some level? And that's something I'd be very interested in. So thank you.
I'll add in, maybe the last point is that I think we can be honest that there's people in this community who can afford to make a lot of these changes to their properties. And we need to be able to capture that work that they're doing and count it as match towards other funding to leverage and bring that dollars in addition to the fee money. But even in the FEMA grant program, people would pay way above and beyond the $2,000 that they were getting back. They were required to match 25%, but people were spending $10,000 and more dollars on projects. And so I think if we can find a way to capture that spending that's going on and leverage the money that our own community is investing internally, that's not coming through government, it's not coming through a grant. But it's being spent by private individuals to either meet insurance standards because they're being forced to by their companies, or just because they are really interested in keeping their home safe. That investment is not insignificant that we can muster from our own citizens.
One of the areas that I think we need to pay close attention to is the large rental community, because if half the population is living in rentals with a good percentage of that in very vulnerable homes, that's not, I won't say it's criminal, but it's inappropriate to endanger people. And we need to facilitate them sharing some of the costs. When I first started this project with Chris, he said, there's no way I'm going to put more money in the pocket of those people that are making a lot of money. And then we realized after doing the interviews that if half the population, especially socially vulnerable population members, are living in substandard housing, we've got to find a solution that doesn't say you pay for it all, but we share costs.
Before we move on from there, so that $8 million then includes the individual home hardening costs for homes.
Yes.
So we would assume that helping people access that money is a leverage potential. I know a couple of years ago when I was connected to the Wildfire Safety Commission and I was on the council, a couple of us met with different local banks, and there's definitely interest in a simplified direct loan, low interest. We may think about something at the council in terms of backing it with utility bills for people who otherwise wouldn't qualify for that lower rate. But a simplified process that's connected into the assessment and contracting process so that those loans would be sure to be put towards the issues that they were given to these folks for. But I think the reality of the world right now is that the notion of granting landlords money to bring their buildings up to standards is, I don't know who gives us money for that, and I know we don't have the money for it. And so if the conversation around regulatory requirements and compliance requirements is also something that we have to be very, very clear about, because we can't subsidize our way out of this with 7,000 plus home units in this town, right? So we have to figure out what does that look like and what does leadership look like for this body. But thank you for that clarification on that money element. And if there's a desire to talk with those banks, I'm happy to let you know and who I've talked with and be part of that. Councilor Kaplan.
Thanks, Mayor, and thanks for this discussion on the finances. I think there's a lot of work and a lot of creative things that can happen with these like really kind of gross numbers. So I look forward to the opportunity eventually to dig into some of that as well. First of all, I wanted to start off by just kudos to the team. It really is a tour de force. I think the whole effort and then the resulting document. It is a compendium of so much that needs to be done, that has been done, and that needs to be done in the future. I think like Dylan, I also am focusing on the implementation period. So where do we move from here? And I think you've started that. You've outlined lots of challenges and even more initiatives. And I gather that little by little, we're going to start getting work plans for each one of those initiatives to really make who's doing what and how. What I picked up from this conversation in terms of that, though, is a real commitment that it's not the city doing it or doing everything. It's really getting it done by empowering and supporting community organizations and individuals and businesses wherever possible. So the city looking at its role a little bit differently than it's maybe looked at in the past, as being a bit of a catalyst and supporter and the glue for bringing things together rather than trying to do it all. And I think that's a really difficult challenge as well. And what I would love to see, Sabrina asked us for a little bit more, if this is our opportunity to ask for any additions or edits. I'm not sure it's an edit, but it's an addition to the plan. I think is something more specific about what are the things that only the city can do, and what are the things that the city must do to empower and support community partners, a wide range of community partners, because it won't get done without the city doing that. You've talked about an individual, a staff person or not a staff person. I mean, I think that could be part of it. I don't know, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about what that might be. I loved, Chris, your comment about leading by example. What comes to my mind is, well, what are we doing to harden our buildings, to create defensible space around our buildings, all of our buildings, every single one of them? We're having a facilities master plan discussion at some point. I think it's almost done. I don't know if that was part of it, but I'd love to hear what we're doing. And then I'd love for us to be able to tell the story to our community that we're doing that, because just doing it is not really going to have the impact if we don't have a clear and consistent and frequent way of telling the story that we're doing it. And then the other thing that I thought, I appreciated your map of the hypothetical fire at Emigrant Lake, and it really brought to mind something that was in the plan. You did talk about working with Jackson County. We talk about working with our neighbor, which is the Forest Service, but we also have a neighbor around other sides of our city limits, which is Jackson County, and so much of what Jackson County does impacts what happens in Ashland, and finding a way and how we working with Jackson County. I think maybe there's an initiative on it. I can't remember exactly, but I think really trying to figure that out as well because we are impacted by what happens just outside of our community. So those are some of my initial reactions, and I really do appreciate all the work that you've done, all of the community engagement that you've done, and I think you've really come up with a really solid piece of work. Look forward to really digging into the details to see how we can actually make it happen.
Before we move on so that we can send coherent body-wide feedback to staff, I wanted to touch back on the comment you had, Councilor Kaplan, around enabling, understanding better what are the tasks in this plan that only the city can do or only the city can do effectively. And I think it's important for us to understand that the city is in a different position than any other organization in the community. And so what is that body of work? You mentioned, one additional staff person. I think it's way low, right? This is a big set of work, and it's a varied set of work. There are different skill sets needed for different elements of this that I think are within that city's required set of tasks. Even if you could find one superhuman person, whether they could actually have all of those skills is really a question. And I think that's what I would like to get to is alongside this implementation plan is that particular enabling question. Well, what is it, and what would it take, really? And so before we move on, I want to see if there's support from the council on having staff provide that for us so that we have a better understanding of what would it actually take for us to do our part in implementing this. Councilor Bloom.
Yeah, just real quick, and thank you, for this, because it is important. So I like what Councilor Kaplan was saying of very clear expectations of the city, formally from the city government. That includes staffing and what that would look like, and also a dollar amount commitment. And obviously be realistic. It would be nice to be like, well, $8 million a year would be great. But it seems that you're fully aware of the importance of the community involvement and outside organizations playing a role. So a conservative number expectation of investment from the city financially.
So that would be what we would be looking at here is the list of tasks and what is the budget figure. Councilor Hanson.
If you don't mind, can I take this thread and put it into a question?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the document's amazing. You even, in the table of contents, you click on where you want to go and it takes you there. But the content in there is so thorough. What I heard today was a lot of new information, and some of it is so obvious. And one of those ahas that I had really is the code enforcement implementation, because you have the early adopters, you have the personal passion, you have the people that are like, I'm in, let's do this. Then there's the mass adoption, and then there's the outliers, people who are just like, no, I don't believe in this or whatever. So how do we get from early adopters to mass adoption? And I don't want to steal anybody's thunder on more code detail questions, but just keeping it higher level. How do we move from where we're at now to enforcing code and doing outreach and getting boots on the ground to implement change? Because nobody else is coming in. We've already serviced those folks, and the mass adoption, people want to do something. I want to help. I also feel like my free time is it's all booked. So if you put in a code enforcement violation or something, I will do it. I'm there. Let's go. What does that look like from where we're at now to next year, and what is that time frame? Yeah. So just higher level. We don't need to talk about who's getting what, but what are your thoughts on that? Because I would like to add that to this mix. Yes, to those.
Well, and I think that's what I heard in Councilor Kaplan's initial conversation is because the code enforcement is only the city can do that, right? So what are these elements that the city has to own? And to that, I would potentially add in there, I saw that the fire side is a subscription-based service and that we don't have, it says there's no funding secured beyond 2025. Is that our funding to pay for the subscription? Or is there some funding issue going on with with the organization itself?
We funded the first initial, Brian, was it a year of Fireside? Out of the grant in order to evaluate it. It really isn't meeting our needs. So in part, it's, we did the dance with Fireside and we decided, maybe they're not the partner we want to go down the road with. So at this point, we're going to explore other options for doing the assessments and collecting the data that are not Fireside.
But there might be a different subscription, right? So I think that what I'm hearing from the council is that we would like to understand and with a line item, right? With clearly identifying what these different line items are in the budget. What is the cost of the city's role? And it includes code enforcement. It includes getting the next group of people to take action, volunteer support, whatever that happens to look like for this body of work that is really the city's to own. What is that particular price tag out of that 8 million, right? Because that seems to be the enabling figure. And so we'll stay on this conversation, but that's the one to speak to. Councilor Sherrill?
No, it's for this. That's okay.
Not yet.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all the work that went into it. I think you were really modest as you glossed over how long you've been working on this. And for people that don't know, this team is kind of a legend in the region for the work that they've done. And I also want to say that it's important that we look at the long-term effect of how this is going to have on people financially as it's implemented. And we need to be careful that we don't have some kind of backfire that the state had, similar to what the state went through when they identified wildfire mapping. So a good example of the volunteer, thank you so much for your time. I mean, what better way to do PE than multiple years of service to the city? So thank you for that. But that's a good example of where somebody's buying a property in the middle of a green field, and because of work we've previously done being the tip of the spear, we've already identified our city as all wildfire hazard area, our city limit. So I just think we should, can you maybe speak to being careful about not having that used against us? And then also the question pertaining to the mayor's direct line items, what's the exact PD that we need to implement that? And could we use our resource officer that we have now that's doing this similar work? Or can we use duty office or duty crews? What's the PD? Can we have some overlap with the staff that we already have and kind of code it as district familiarization, city fam, while they're already on the clock?
So before we dive into that, let's separate those. We're still on the topic of this direction back to staff with what to come back with. But what I hear you adding, Councilor Sherrill, is this idea around leveraging some of our other resources at the city, right, alongside that budget. So what does it look like that needs to be done? What are the elements, if any, that we can add with our existing team? What is the gap that needs to get us there? Is that what I'm hearing you from on the second issue?
Yeah. Thank you, Mayor.
Yeah.
Leverage would be a hard word, but it's what are the actual duties, and does it fit the PD of the staff that we currently have, so we can ask for less money or less full-time employees?
Right. So what we need to do at this point is to just determine whether that's general direction to go back to staff. And then Councilor Duquesne, I have you next in line because I know you had something else to bring up. So let's, I'm seeing general agreement that we would like to see this body of information come back when we see the plan that includes what are our particular elements that the city is responsible for, what would it cost, what could also be done with our existing team, and making sure that it includes the full spectrum of the public engagement and the wildfire assessments, whatever it is that we see that's in here that needs to really sit within the city's operations. If that is something that we want to see come back, you can do it with a nod of the head. We don't all have to speak to it, but does that look generally right? That we want to see that when they come back for approval? Yes? Okay. Sabrina.
So just a clarifying question, because one of the big kind of outstanding issues is our current municipal code. And so right now, code compliance is voluntary. So We are not out patrolling looking for code violations. They are coming into us. So what I'm hearing, though, is kind of a change in philosophy, potentially around how we do that with code enforcement. And I just want to clarify that this body is interested in changing the code to reflect that change.
City manager?
Go ahead.
For my part, I'm just curious what their vision was. Like, I'm interested in the line items, but the other part of my question is you've been living this, writing this document. What are your thoughts? Like, how are we going to get to mass adoption?
Yeah. And if I can just follow up on that too, in terms of the code compliance element, we have consistently heard that we are at capacity for code violations because we have a variety of different ordinances. And the plan here involves some new regulatory requirements over the next couple of years, right? We're going to strengthen some of those. And so what does that mean? And you can think about that in whichever way you'd like to. It can still be voluntary, complaint driven. But what does that look like? What would be a good start if we need additional capacity in that element and make sure that it gets included? So does it generally look right that we would like that body of information to come back when it comes back? I'm seeing head nods. Yes, Councilor Duquesne.
And it would include what Councilor Sherrill brought up also in a line item.
In terms of the impact on people's finances?
What we already have.
Yes, using what we already have, indeed.
Okay.
Yes, so that would be part of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Can you clarify whether you want that to be edits to the plan or as like
A separate document.
Separate document.
Separate
Accompanying
document.
or something.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That makes things a lot easier. Jerry just exhaled.
Is it on this topic,
Yes,
Councilor
it
Dale?
is.
Councilor Dale?
And just a quick clarifying point to that is that please, and I would hope that you would include any efficiencies that can be gained. So not just to add layers and layers of code, but if there's anything that can be deleted because it's no longer effective or anything else that allows us to be most efficient with personnel time and technologies or whatever, that would be part of it. How can we, just kind of take a look at it holistically?
I understand.
Okay. And then I assume that we are going to be looking at hardening our facilities as part of the facility master plan. Are we thinking in those terms?
That's not part of the current plan. The current plan is looking at the facilities we own and their level of rehabilitation needed, as well as space needs for the organization and what facilities we can divest of. So hardening the facilities that we retain would be kind of the next step.
But we can anticipate that that's part of that overall facilities planning process, that whatever we keep, or do you need direction from staff to add that, or from council to add that?
So the study is complete. So that would be a follow-on element.
Right.
That we will need
And it's
to do.
included in this plan, so if the council adopts this plan, then that would automatically create that next step. Okay. All right, so I have a stack here I want to go back to. Councilor Duquesne.
Thank you for your work on this. It was very informative and much needed. Some of the things I heard, Chris, were really good. I'm glad that we have the ability to measure as we grow and as we get better at this. I think it's important for us to know where we were, where we are, and where we're going. So I appreciate that. And also, I wholeheartedly agree, 47% of Ashland is renters. So how do we keep them safe, working with the property management companies? That's going to be an interesting thing to pursue. But one thing that I want, and I think my colleagues had great questions. Thank you so much, and I look forward to that coming back to us. But something that I wanted to touch a little bit on was code. And I'm sure this is a heavy lift for one individual to keep an eye on all of Ashland. However, as we move forward, before I get into part two, as we move forward, I'm hoping that the private citizens that are doing work on their properties, that we can give them some props and joy to maybe make other people get enthusiastic about it. And if I did it, you can do it, because I do know of an HOA that Brian knows it's doing it. So we'll. But what I wanted to do is ask about June the 2nd. That is the day when fire fuel is to be mitigated in Ashland. And I have had my constituents come up to me, bring me pictures, and show me what fire fuel that's almost as tall as I am. And this is July, and we were within 6 miles of an active fire. What can we do to have things, and I know some of it is private property, and I know in the past that you've gone to private owners and knocked on the door and said, this has got to go, and a lot of it was city property. What do we need to do to not be here in this situation again?
That is a great question, and it speaks to how challenging enforcement can be, especially when it's just complaint driven, which generates plenty of business in our weed abatement program, and I'm sure across a lot of code enforcement as well. Some of it's contextual. We don't know if some of those properties maybe were on the outside of the city limits, which is a significant issue that was identified in the CWPP, and not having any regulatory authority to enact any kind of weed abatement on properties that could certainly influence the flammability of structures within the city. So I can't speak to exact situations because I don't know the geography of where the pictures came from, though also on properties greater than an acre, you only have to cut a perimeter around and buffer structures and access ways. So there are many places in the community on lots greater than an acre. You could go out and take pictures of tall grass and it would be completely legal according to our current codes. And that's just a function of just the practicality of implementing it. I mean, if somebody owns 10 acres, you're gonna make them go out with a weed whacker and cut 10 acres worth of grass. We'll bankrupt our own parks department if we require them to do that on all of the city and public works properties that need to comply with weed abatement. So in part, the standards for implementation exist because there's a dose of reality needed there that, you know, we aren't gonna try to impose that on our own departments, nor on owners who can't afford to mitigate acres and acres and acres of dry grass every year.
If I may, thank you. This was in city limits. It's on Tolman Creek, off Tolman, very close to Ashland Street. And when you drive down Ashland Street, when you drive up Ashland to the left, it looks great, private property. And then to the right, it looks terrible, where some is private and some is public. My question is, it's factual because it's there, so it's not just complaint driven. This is actually there. It's less than an acre, and it is fire fuel, and that is a concern to the residents who live here. If one side of Ashland burns, all of Ashland can burn. And it was a very big concern when we are within 6 miles of an active wildfire. That is what led the conversation, and it's real. So I have to bring up code enforcement, because if not, I am not doing my job. So I'm hoping that we don't have to be here again.
So it seems, I think it's a good question for all of us to understand, which is because we all get those conversations. We've all had pictures sent, or someone stops us in the grocery store. So we should be sending them to the see-click-fix space so that they can file a report, and then that will get it over to the code enforcement officers. So then they'll know about these properties. So I think it's important for us to just keep that in mind. Councilor Sherrill, you're next in the line. I know you had two topics the last time. Did you want to take up the one around the cost element?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. And I just don't want to be questioning costs like I don't care. Like, life safety is the first thing we need to pay for. We talk a lot about affordability, and this is going to cost money, not just to implement the program and to figure out if it's a zoning thing. Who has the stick, right? We've seen that you talked greatly to incentives haven't worked. People didn't do this when we gave them money. Now we're going to have to do some kind of enforcement, especially if we want to hit our audacious goal of 90%, which is awesome. I definitely think that would be the city's role. Maybe you could speak to, like, what does enforcement look like in the next 10 years to get to 90% hardening? And then also, do you have an idea of the cost that's going to be had where the rubber meets the road by the actual homeowner? I know you've facilitated a lot of this work over the years, so if you could just touch on that.
Absolutely. The vision in the CWPP isn't that we hire a code enforcement officer tomorrow, works out of the fire department and just does wildfire code, not even the weed abatement code that we were just talking about, but just, a new set of codes on structure hardening and defensible space. And, we just start citing people and saying, you're out of compliance. That is not the vision in this CWPP. The vision is to go heavy on education and early adopters and creating visible projects that are models for the community to see. It's something we did in the very early stages of the AFR project. We just started with the easy work, and we made sure we did it in really visible places so that people could get to it by parking at a trailhead and seeing some work done in the forest. And taking people on tours to see it right away so that they could envision, oh, that's what you're talking about when you talk about understory thinning and piling and burning, technical terms. And I think in a similar vein, we are going to do that with this project to say, okay, can we create pilot projects that are the city buildings and facilities? Can we get early adopters to allow us to take tours of their properties and say, oh, okay, that's what that looks like. And even just to go to places that are already being built to code under the current standards. The one that I keep passing just below the train tracks right out here on what becomes North Mountain, the large development, sorry, I don't know the name of it there, being built is all being built to code. I keep looking at it going, gosh, that looks really good. And I don't think it even registers with people. They're just like, oh, another pretty community going up in Ashland. And they don't realize that that is being constructed due to specific codes and wildfire protection. And we need to call that out and say, look, this has already been happening in our community over the last, the defensible space code was 2018, home hardening was 2021. So we have actually a lot of building stock that's starting to accumulate where we can point to it and say, look, this was done according to standards, and nobody has thrown up their arms and said, you're building something really ugly in our town. We're actually, embracing that and saying, no, this is a nice looking neighborhood. And if we can point out the safety benefits of those places, I think we can get people more on board with what we're talking about and wanting them to do. Yeah, it's a lot more challenging to retrofit a property for wildfire than it is to build it from the ground up. That's just the way it is, and it's going to be more challenging, but I think we can make that happen in places that are visible, that we can take people to. We can feature them on social media, websites. I expect that we will be doing all of those things as part of the outreach around this. And giving people time, I think that's the other most important thing about this. Again, not showing up tomorrow with a citation book and a badge, but showing up and saying, hey, here's a brochure about what this project is. Here are the standards. We are going to roll it out in a way that is strategically smart across the landscape, not scattershot. We want to actually develop the most wildfire protection as we go that we can geographically throughout the city. So the most vulnerable areas first, and the most vulnerable structures and populations as well. And in doing that, we can say, okay, now you have 3 years or whatever the timeline is we decide to get to the point where we're going to come back and say, yes, your house is certified, or you need a little bit more here, and this is what you need to do. So I just want to make sure everybody out there in the public understands this isn't going to be something that we just snap our fingers and say, you got to do this tomorrow. This is something that's going to take building up the momentum, building up the examples, building the capacity in the organization to actually roll it out, and educating the workforce to actually make it happen out there before we can just come to somebody's residence and say, okay, now you got to meet the code. Well, we have to have all these other things in place before we get to that point.
Madam Mayor, may I add on to what Chris was saying? I changed seats with Sharice briefly because I had a couple things to add to Councilmember Bloom's, question and such. So I'll just kind of throw some different things in here that touch on all of these. I keep hearing capacity, capacity, capacity. I mean, that's really what it's about, right? And whether that's funding capacity or stakeholder, collaborative capacity by working with other organizations or whatnot. There are lots of creative ways to build capacity. And as Councilor Bloom had mentioned, looking at that appendices, I just want to point out, a voter-approved levy would help with some of that. Summit County, Colorado had a mill levy that they passed where they brought in various disparate interests. So they had affordable housing, they had open space management, they had wildfire mitigation tied into one mill levy. And so it brought in folks that maybe wouldn't have voted for one to vote for it anyway. And it's passed twice now that I'm aware of. I don't know if it's still going, but that provided a lot of funding. And with that mill levy, they could use all the funding in any one year for any one of those categories, or they could spread it evenly across the board, depending upon what the needs were for that next particular year. And so that's a creative way of building that capacity. Austin, Texas, realized that they had a capacity for code enforcement, so they brought in 6 lieutenants that are working in the fire prevention division, and all those lieutenants do is go out and inspect brand new construction in wildfire prone areas. Obviously, you don't have that sort of growth like Austin, Texas does, but you have new development. You have, structures that are being restored and retrofitted. You have the capacity to potentially create a fee, and that's what they did. It was a fee-based approach. I think it was $250 per inspection, and there was an initial capital outlay that was required for that. But the program has funded itself. It has funded those 6 lieutenant inspectors that are doing that kind of work. And there's just, and then one more point, for new developments out there, if you try to push the onus off onto the HOA to maintain that over time, on their architectural review committees, design review committees. And I'm saying that because I write wildfire safety plans for new developments also in Idaho. And the wildfire safety plan requires that they incorporate that plan into the CC&Rs for the development. It says specifically in the wildfire safety plan that the architectural review committee and design review committees shall maintain that over time. So 50 years down the road, it doesn't look like some of our older communities that were platted out in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So there's other creative ways of trying to build that capacity. And I know Chris and I have talked a lot about this. So anyway, thank you.
That's helpful. Thank you. Councilor Hanson, did you have something else? I had you in the queue from earlier. You did. And then Councilor Dale?
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I have to preface this by saying I've got a thing for technical documents. So this was just an outstanding read, and it was as much as I wanted to really enjoy it, it was surprisingly mixed emotions relative to just the pride of all the efforts and the vision that went into this, and the collaboration was just beyond phenomenal. And at the same time, it was an extremely terrifying document. And that's just the reality that we live in. And, before I get into my question, I just wanted to touch on something I was resonating with Sharice when she was talking earlier. I get to live, my wife's in real estate and leadership, and she routinely works with leadership at the state level and so forth, and all the good work that's going on with lenders and insurance companies, because most of those that they work with here are local small businesses, and they are trying their hardest to find a way to say yes just for their own business, but to get people into homes. And I get to live vicariously through that homeownership journey, and I can say unequivocally that it has changed from once upon a time where you were fingers crossed that your loan got approved. It is almost every single time it is, am I going to get insurance? It is not an issue of lending. It is an issue of insurance, full stop, on almost everything that I see behind the scenes. And it comes down to the last minute. And so that is a very, very real thing that I'm hoping that we can do everything we can to work at scale with insurance companies, local, state, federal, to be able to say, we're leadership, look at what we've done to be able to help. My question, though, is kind of a follow-on to what my colleagues have been saying here relative to affordability. Because this is kind of the time where I start really thinking about the very uncomfortable questions that we have to ask. Mm-hmm. And normally it's kind of difficult during council study sessions because normally the presenters are, it's their thing or their department or whatever. So I feel comfortable asking here because of all the collaboration across all of the people that contributed to this document. But I guess what I want my question, what I'm looking for is out of all the research, all the collaboration, all the conversations, out of all the discussions, what are going to be, let's just put it out there, what are going to be the top 3 most uncomfortable topics that we're going to have to deal with relative to affordability? Because as wonderful as this document is, it's going to bump right up against things like transportation or climate or housing or other things that while they all look like they click together, there's going to be something, and they all kind of have this singularity of affordability. So what are some hard sacrifices we might have to make with this document? What are some hard sacrifices or conversations we're going to have on the other side of this document relative to affordability? Some realities that people are going to, like you said, Ashland's going to look different.
Right.
There's a section in the document where,
Coming close.
I'm sorry, there's someplace in Texas is trying to build affordable housing. And I read an article that said that they were essentially lost funding for it because of these issues. They can't get loans because of these issues. So they are very much linked together. But making sure that you can rebuild smartly, so for the long term it remains affordable, is better than having everything burned down and then having to try to rebuild.
I'm sorry, I just want to ask a clarifying question relative to that. You said they're losing funding because of these additional regulations, or because these regulations aren't being put in place?
Because the loans, the insurance for their loans is not coming through. I'll try to send you the article. It's had a big impact on communities that are trying to build affordable housing.
Okay.
Yeah, the same issue, the same real estate issue, I think, that you're talking about is hitting those public housing developments.
Yeah, they're cutting the developments in half because they can't afford, because the insurers are not providing the insurance.
Well, what about for existing homeowners and so forth? I mean, like we briefly touched on, let's say landlords, and we just have to. There's a reality there that there are just individuals that it's not a company, it's not a hedge fund, it's something that they maybe that subsidize some of their own mortgage, and now they're being priced out, and it might be at cost. I'm just saying there's conversations, there's trade-offs that we have to have with existing residents too, relative to affordability. What are some of those uncomfortable conversations that we have to have on both sides of this?
I'm not exactly sure I'm answering it correctly, but one of the conversations that I'm trying to get people to have is, instead of focusing on, you do this, your insurance rates will go down, is not realistic. You do this, you will get insurance, hopefully at an affordable rate. That's the real story these days. That's the first myth to get rid of. Sometimes I hear politicians say that if you do this, your rates could go down. But from everything I read, that's not going to happen. What we could do, though, is if this community was essentially met the expectations of this plan, I could envision a future where all of the things that we want to happen, the rates go down, is because we've proven that we are not going to be expensive to insure. In the long term, in the big picture, this might be the most insurable city around, and the rates could go down. But that's a pipe dream right now. The insurance industry is trying to recalibrate and figure out how to run its business model. The Wildfire Prepared Homes program, even though all the research comes from the industry itself, it's the Insurance Institute of Business and Home Safety is doing the research and prescribing these standards. none of the insurance companies have said, if you do this, you will get insurance, because they're trying to decide whether that's appropriate or not. It might happen in the next year or two, but like State Farm is definitely on board with it. Their logo is sponsored in the program, but they don't make a commitment. So the real challenge is, can you get insurance? And I think if we do this, we will be much more likely to get it. And that goes for affordable housing too. If you can't insure the housing at all, or you can't get the loan because they have no insurance, there's a problem. I'll try to send you the article.
I think just to reinforce that, I think a lot of what is behind this is trying to flip the narrative and make Ashland seen as this place of safety where people can go for many, many reasons in the era of climate change to be able to kind of weather the storm and feel like they can be safe here, they can invest here, that we can have affordable housing that's not under threat of loss of insurance or of a wildfire, where people are supported, where businesses can invest and feel like they can have their employees live here. Those are decisions that are being made based on climate change factors already across the board. And we are trying to make our community seen as a place where instead of it's a big red dot, it's actually a big green dot on the map. And that is actually being analyzed by a company called First Street in terms of whether climate is influencing populations to leave places or influencing populations to migrate to places. And right now, we are, as a region of Southern Oregon, we are a place that people are leaving for climate-related reasons. And we want to change that to where we are a place that people look to, like, oh, you've done something really proactive here. You're managing your forests. You're investing in your community for safety and making it a place that people want to be for many reasons, whatever that is related to climate change, and there are many even beyond wildfire. But there's, certainly we have a base level of attraction that makes people want to live here, and we need to both retain that, but also to create a community that is seen as safe and safe to invest in.
Your question about insurance.
Well, and I realize we're out of time.
Well, what do we have to do to gather some additional time?
Just make a motion to extend for 30 minutes.
The floor is open for a request. Councilor Dale,
Thanks, Mayor. I move to extend the study session for 30 minutes.
is there a second? Any discussions? Any discussion?
Nope.
Roll call, please, Alyssa. Oh, actually, we can't hear. We just, head nods? Head nods. Okay, we'll give direction that we'll carry on for 30 more minutes. So is that an insurance question?
Just to his question and point that he was making.
Okay, and then we'll come back to insurance, that's fine.
Yeah, just real quick, and I think, and correct me if I was wrong, Councilor Dale, but one of the things that I was picking up on there in the question comment was about the uncomfortable choices that we have to make. We're sitting here talking about a financial investment in these kind of programs, and this is very important work, right? This is existential to the future of Ashland, and I think for not only for the community, but for all of us up here, there are all things that we care about, right? Whether it's transportation, bike lanes, climate, parks, housing, these are all really important priorities for us, and it's going to be, and for the community, and the community and we all need to understand that we can't do all of those things the way that we would like to. And so we need to be very open and clear-eyed about there are priorities of nice to have, and then there are priorities like this that are existential, and we need to put our money, in places that are important.
Go ahead.
Can I just illustrate one of the situations that I think you were getting at, Councilor Dale, is where we're almost at loggerheads, and it was in one of the maps when we showed of density. And certainly we have been passing policies to create more and more density, reduce transportation times, carbon, a lot of reasons to create a denser community. But with wildfire, that is not a positive attribute. We do require ADUs, as Councilor Sherrill will attest to. ADUs do have to meet the wildfire code standard, but every time we plug another structure in a space that would have served as that structure separation distance on the map, and what's shown in the research, we shrink that distance and shrink the distance. We put more people into the matrix for an evacuation. It's more vehicles, more challenges, more people parking on streets and not in their driveways, which makes evacuation more challenging. So certainly denser populations create a bit more of a headache on the wildfire front. And it's just one of those things that we're gonna have to keep wrestling with. We've passed the code already that does satisfy some of the issues with creating a denser community. But we have a lot of work to do on that front with the houses that were not built to code.
There was one thing that was done well. I was really concerned about the bike lanes. They're going to interfere with evacuation, is what I saw it. But I'm a climate advocate, a climate change adaptation advocate as well. But you made the decision not to put hard barriers, instead to have soft barriers, so that when we have to evacuate, those lanes don't count. So one of the things that I would encourage is every decision you make, you look at the trade-offs with a wildfire lens on.
Go ahead, Councilor Day.
And that's exactly, and thanks, Chris, thanks, Sharice, for that. This is exactly what I was getting at. I probably got there not as eloquently as you guys picked up on, but that's exactly kind of the conversations is really, it's the trade-offs is when we're sitting up here, it is, I mean, if we could do it all, we'd do it all. But trying to figure out how to get those to click in, and to be quite honest with you, there's going to be the difficult conversations, and then there's going to be, for lack of a better term, maybe some unseen, unforced errors on our own part because we didn't think about that. So just having those cross-functional, cross-department discussions and just bringing realities to leadership to say, hey, this is going, we're going to get 80% of the way here. Of course, we'd like to get 100%. But this is just one of those realities that we're going to have to deal with. Those are the things that I think would be extremely valuable, I know, speaking for myself, to understand.
Yeah. And in terms of the, kind of coming back to the insurance question, I think one of the things for us to be thinking about is really the pie, right? So we have, when the risk pie involves the risk you reduce, the risk you transfer with insurance, and the risk you simply bear. And right now, that pie is, the pieces are not where they need to be in terms of their relationship to each other. We are bearing a huge amount of that pie. And we're losing the ability to transfer some of it because we haven't done as much risk reduction as we need to do. And I know that the insurance companies, they're trying to figure out how to keep insuring people, but it's different. You know, if I latch my roof down in hurricane country, I have a pretty decent chance of keeping my house together. The same isn't necessarily true with wildfire for the exact reasons you've all been talking to us about tonight. Is I could do everything on my property right, and if my neighbor doesn't, they still burn my house down. And the insurance companies, the reason we're dealing with all of this is because they accurately price risk. It's their business to do that correctly. And when we see these numbers going, we need to understand that that is a reflection of our increased risk. And we need to do something with that risk pool. And I think, but to the question around equity is, as we go through all this work, I think it's going to be imperative that we ask two questions: who benefits and who pays? And I think that comes back to the affordable question, because what people really can't afford, to your point, Sharice, is to have their house burned down, whether they're renting or whether they're owning. That is really the unaffordable piece of this. And so the question, I think, is about how do we do a lot of these things that are here. So I had a question, Chris, about one of the items that you had identified here. It was related to the insurance. You actually had two of them. It was in IN-1.2 and IN-2.1. And it's really where they're talking about creating task forces to develop sustainable, accessible insurance options for all housing types. And then in terms of the insurance options for renters. And I, just knowing what I know about the way the insurance world is working, I don't know that I don't understand the role that we would have there. I could certainly see a role as a pilot community. I know that there are interesting new parametric insurance options and different kinds of things that the insurance world is starting to, they're starting to pilot and try to figure out. And I would hope that Ashland would position itself for those. But I don't understand the role of these task forces and how they would actually operate within the reality of how the insurance companies are trying to address this problem?
There are obviously some things in the insurance issue that we are not going to be able to change. They are, national trends. Losses in other markets are impacting our market. We're not going to change those losses from floods in Texas and in North Carolina. There's a lot driving that in the insurance and specifically the reinsurance market that insures the big insurance companies. That said, one of the findings out of the surveys that we did is unrelated to the owner's insurance, but more related to the renter's insurance, which actually remains really cheap for renters insurance, and yet so many people in our community don't have it that are renters. And so some of the initiatives in here are targeted at how do we get together with the rental companies. Some do actually require renters insurance, but many don't. Most don't. Some landowners do, or landlords do, some don't. How can we create a more blanket policy or education initiative that will equal renters having either being required to or having a lot more access to the rental insurance that they should be getting and is for most people pretty affordable still. A different topic than the property owner getting insurance for the property, but nonetheless important for that rental population who, as we saw during the Alameda fire, when people lose everything in rentals, more often than not, they just, for a lot of reasons, don't come back to that place.
There was one person I interviewed who has a disabled child, lives in an apartment building in the Railroad District, very low income. It's a multi-generational family, and they survived the Alameda fire. Despite their financial challenges, as a consequence of that experience, she pays $20 a month for renter's insurance. She made that choice, and that's the kind of thing we would like to, when we talk for a task force, we understand we don't control that business. So including property managers and landlords in advising people to do that or requiring it, depending on would save a lot of people a lot of grief.
So I guess that was my question, is there a way to potentially reword that so that it reflects, a role that the city actually could play, and maybe also to reinforce that element around positioning the community to work with insurance companies when they are trying to pilot new programs.
Yeah.
And in that way, it builds on the IBHS program, because you're right, it's the insurance, that organization researches these things for the insurance world. So if we can show that we have a very robust program that is helping people reach the IBHS standards, that might actually go further towards helping them get insurance than creating a task force that doesn't have as direct of an impact or ability to engage with the insurance companies in terms of defining or creating those insurance products.
And these particular challenge statements were worked out with a team, a group, including somebody from Access. Mm-hmm. And they have a program to help people get this insurance at certain income levels. And so we were looking at learning from them collaboratively what we can do here.
Yeah. Councilor Duquesne?
Yeah. Thank you, Cherise. And that was something that I was kind of touching base on too. How do we work with the property management companies? Because so many renters don't even think about renters insurance. And so it's like, what? And I think that's easy access, low hanging fruit there that I think we could definitely get in touch with. But my question was something you brought up earlier, Chris. You were talking about partnering with others. And I know that ODF can only do so much. I'm looking at federal funding that we don't have a lot of right now. And I'm partnering, the wind was blowing in the other direction the day we had the Alameda fire. If it had been blowing in the other direction, it could have been Ashland. But I think about our our neighbors around us. This is a small little valley that we live in. And so you talked about partnering, and I think about partnering, what does that look like financially, and who are you talking about when you say partnering?
That is a great question. We have had a lot of conversations in putting this plan together with different organizations. I'm not going to commit any of them. I mean, we have the Chamber of Commerce here. Thank you, Sandra, for supporting us. But like working with Access, we did have some conversations with Access. We have Access in our community now doing work on rental properties to make them more energy efficient. Could Access then just at the same time be doing wildfire safety work while they're doing energy efficiency work? It's the same conversation we've had with the Ashland Climate Collaborative, yet another group in our community who is advocating for energy efficiency, and especially in rental properties, and even to the point of now hiring a staff member who is doing the outreach to try to connect people to programs. Similar win-win, I think, in being able to partner with those organizations and say, how can we increase your capacity? How can you help meet our community's need by helping educate residents? I think there are a lot of organizations that we haven't even, maybe not a lot, but there are some that we haven't even thought about as being connected in a way that could help us achieve the ultimate goal of fire resilience for the entire community. And so part of that is sitting down. We have a list of cooperators in the plan already, having discussions with all of them and saying, okay, to what degree can you be in on this? What do you need to be a participant in this partnership? Thinking back to the AFR project again, as the Forest Service soliciting the city and Lomakatsi and the Nature Conservancy and saying, hey, do you want to be part of this? You guys helped put together the plan. And that's where we are right now with this CWPP is, hey, you guys contributed to this plan. How do you see yourself being a part of the solution, and what can we do to get you to the table?
Some of them have asked that, or told us that they would need some compensation to participate because they're nonprofits.
Absolutely.
So,
Go ahead.
really quick. So, when I think about where we are with dollars and cents right now, and writing grants is probably not going to happen anytime soon. But looking at the big picture, I believe the fire department's been very good at writing grants and getting grants. So looking down the road, I can see that happening. Looking at things immediately in front of us, I don't know how that's going to look, but I look forward to seeing what you bring back so that we can take a closer look at that and see how we can get the money immediately, because right now it's not there. A couple of years from now, I'm hoping it will be, so I look forward to that. And I really appreciate you reaching out, and hopefully this can ripple down the road to other neighboring municipalities, because like I said, we're all in this little valley together. So thank you. And maybe on Wednesday, we can get some recruits.
I think a couple of interesting anecdotes from the forest management world is I've had several conversations. One of them is happening this week with private foundations and private funders who want to be part of the solution. We've been solicited, not necessarily the AFR project, but a broader movement across the Rogue Valley several times from different foundations saying, hey, our board of directors is really interested in the wildfire topic. And actually, the Oregon Business Council is the one that's most interested right now. And we're going to have a conversation with a representative from their board on Wednesday about the Rogue Basin strategy for forest resilience. Similar to what we're talking about here, just on the community side. So, who is going to jump in and say, yeah, we really want to see a community achieve that level of wildfire safety. And nobody else is proposing that I see anywhere in the country. And I think, again, that is one of those feathers in the cap to say, hey, we've tackled this issue in our forests, and we're going to keep doing that. And now we want to do it in our community. So, hey, send us $5 million, and we want to show proof of concept that this can be done.
Councilor Bloom?
Yeah, I had a kind of a novel idea around this insurance question in renters, and then I realized that there's no lawyer here, so I'm going to be wise, and we can discuss that another time.
Councillor Hanson.
Yeah, parting thought, we've got this great USDA energy efficiency on-bill financing program that we're bringing on board. Is there any kind of overlap and ability to add that as a checkbox? Like, that was just brilliant. You know, we have the Ashland Climate Collaborative talking to a homeowner or a renter, and then, you know, we go from heat pumps to defendable space. We're already there. It's an easy transition. I just want to put that on our radar to investigate.
Like one of the things, if you're doing something to the building, simply fixing the screens so that they're the right diameter and the right type of screen isn't very expensive, and it could be done en masse if it's attached to another initiative.
Right. I think that there's a real possibility there. That was a gem.
Yeah. So one of my questions comes back to there's a statement in here that says that basically the best way to get people to take action is to talk to them in person, right? We know that. And then it says it's impossible to do this with 21,000 people. But it strikes me that we don't need to do that with 21,000 people. We need it to do it with however many households and business owners we have, right? And that's a way smaller number, 8,000 maybe. Yeah. But, you know, there are models out there of, you know, neighborhood ambassadors. And we have our CERT program. And it has often intrigued me about where these things might come together, where we could potentially carve up our evacuation zones into neighborhoods and have the CERT people, whoever wants to sign up and take on a neighborhood, and this may be the way that we get more folks coming into that program, but they agree that 4 times a year, they're gonna come out and they're gonna knock on the door of their neighbors and they're gonna talk to them about a variety of things, right? And we can decide what that all is, but it would be heavily focused on wildfire risk reduction. We have a new welcome packet coming to people who are new to town. They should immediately know what not to buy and plant, right? And then not make those immediate mistakes. But to have that element, and then to have the city in some way and other organizations in some way support the celebrations. And I saw that you mentioned those here, that we need community celebrations. People need to have the, yes, we're serious about getting this done, but they also need to have the piece that says, here's where you could come and join your neighbors. And no, nobody knows how to do this perfectly, but we're going to figure it out together. That kind of element where we're dissuading people from one space and welcoming them to another, I think there is real potential with the CERT model. And when I talk to people who are involved with CERT, one of the things they tell me is that it's hard for them to get new volunteers. And my suspicion is that when we're trying to recruit, people think that what you do with CERT is you get ready for the big one and then you wait, right? And like, okay, right? But what if we had a very active and engaged process where people took on that ambassador role and they were knocking on the doors and they were talking to people about what they see and they were encouraging people to get the full assessment done or whatever that looks like. And then inviting them to a potluck. It's not like the city has to pay for a barbecue, right? There are ways of encouraging these neighborhood to neighborhood interactions that I think are really key in the social structure of that. So my hope would be that we would be thinking about those kinds of leverages when we look at this. You know, volunteers take time, they take investment, volunteer programs do, but we can't do this without Ashlanders putting their shoulder to the wheel. And so what does it look like for us to get the wheel in front of them, right? What does it look like for us to set that table? And then one of the other elements that I was thinking of is we have other organizations in the community, and we're talking about having them come in partnership. And one of the things I think the city wouldn't be able to do well is to have some sort of mass buying program, if you will, right? So there is a mental thing that happens in the brain that says, I'm going to get my trimmings done because I can take them free to the transfer station today, right? It's $14 if I don't do it today, but I'm going to do it today because it's free, right? And we see what happens on the days that we have those. I think it would be interesting if we worked with some of these local organizations that are talking to folks to, what if we said, guess what, the tree trimmers are going to be in your neighborhood the first 2 weeks of March, and if you sign up now, you get a 10% discount. But you've got to get on the schedule while they're in the neighborhood. That's the only reason you get a discount. They would probably go for that if they had 2 weeks of work lined up in evacuation zone 2 or something like that, right? Is there a way for us to work with community partners to say, how can we create that sense of urgency that we too often are missing around these elements, and then loop in some of the affordability elements? What happens if you can't pay for that tree trimmer to come? What are the programs that could help? So just some things to think about.
That's why we need a facilitator, is because you can see these ideas just start rolling out, but to make them real requires effort.
Yeah.
And that's the key to moving this forward. The other thing I'd caution you about, basically, because when I interview people, it's not all about neighborhoods. It might be about a small community, and there's a lot of fear of authority. So when I would interview people, one person in particular said, I would never have allowed the fire department on my property. Because whatever it is. So we have to engage people where they're at, and it might not be at the neighborhood level. There are family organizations. Sometimes one Hispanic family told me that they get everything from a certain family group that they work with. So we've got to open the door, our minds, to many different options, and to figure that out means that we go to the people and set them up, help them get going. And some of our neighbors, Talent, the whole Firebrand Collective, long-term recovery program have built an incredible network of options and opportunities that we could take advantage of.
Yeah.
As long as we don't brand it the City of Ashland. They don't like that.
Right. And I think that's the point of all of the partnerships, right? Is to have it not be entirely the city and have different kind of folks showing up and helping. It strikes me that we have a lot of the elements here for a major shift of culture.
Yes.
And we have to get to that place of radical self-reliance of our neighbors, our neighborhoods. From the pre-disaster to the evacuation space, there's all sorts of places where we have to understand that we are on our own if we have one of these moments. And I think that's a hard conversation to have, but I think we have to figure out how to do it. So any final comments? We have a couple minutes. So we will see you all back in August. I have some additional comments, just some thoughts that I'll send across. Nothing major, but really great conversation. And I think to just close this up, one of the things that I think human beings have a tendency to do is to say, well, this is what I can do with what I have, right? And in this plan, what we have said is this is what needs to get done. And so I think it's going to be important to make sure that we line up the implementation in the same way and say not what can one more hire get done of this, but what needs to get done, where is the leadership in the community, how do we bring all the pieces together? Because what's at risk is enormous. And we are more and more aware of that every year as we move into fire season. So thank you again for your great work. It is, I know it's been a couple of years in the making, and look forward to seeing you again in August.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
Meeting adjourned.